Hello and welcome back. This is Botany 101 and I'm Angela Nishimoto. Glad to see you. Okay, so today we're doing plant systematics. Our objectives for today include, we're going to go over the history of classification. Secondly, we're going to talk about the work of Carl von Linné, also known as Carolus Linnaeus, and he's also called the father of taxonomy. Thirdly, we're going to go over binomial nomenclature, all right? Binomial nomenclature. And fourthly, we're going to go through the taxonomic hierarchy, and then, what is a species anyway, all right? Okay, so plant systematics. This has to do with the naming of, identifying of, and classifying of plants. Sometimes systematics is also referred to as taxonomy, even though systematics and taxonomy, a little bit different definitions, but usually they use interchangeably, all right? Okay, so here we have a picture of Xylodum nudum, okay? One of the things you notice is that the plant here doesn't have any leaves, and the stems are green. So in this plant, you have photosynthetic stems. Another thing about it you might notice are these little yellow structures here. These are part of the reproductive apparatus of the plant, and these will produce spores. Okay, so this is one species, Xylodum nudum, and this one here is erect in terms of its habits. You can see it's kind of standing up straight. Secondly, we also have another species of Xylodum, Xylodum complanatum. Okay, you can see that it has a pendant species. It tends to hang down. Okay, you can see that the stems are also green. It also has these sporangia that bear the spores, but they are actually different species. Okay, so remember that systematics has to do with identification and naming and classification of plants, and this is showing that these two species are actually in different species. Okay. All right, next, here we have a nice photograph of Amau, okay, also known as Sadleria. And this one here happens to be of this particular species, Sadleria cyathoides, all right? You can see it has a particular look to it. And if you look at another species of Sadleria, it's a little bit different. Okay, you can see that this area here, this trunk area, is more slender, and it is different looking. Okay, so that's one way you can distinguish one species from another, right? Sometimes they look a little bit different. And here, of course, is the native white hibiscus, right? The Coquio keo, and this is also known as Hibiscus ornatianus, and it's in a family. We're going to go into that a little later. It's in a family known as the Malvaceae, also known as the mallow family. Okay, and here's a nice image taken by John Obata, and this one here is actually a picture of our state flower, Hibiscus brackenridgii, also known as Ma'ohauhele. Okay, you can see that it looks very similar in some ways, structural ways, like this structure here, to the Coquio keo, but you can tell that it is indeed different, right, in terms of the type it is. And here's a native red hibiscus, Hibiscus clayi. Some people call it the Coquio ula, okay, because the word coquio means hibiscus in Hawaiian, yeah? So it's also known as Coquio ula, or the red hibiscus. Okay, so here you can also see that this plant, okay, has kind of strap-shaped petals. Yeah, and it is, very similar to the others in structure, except it is indeed different, okay? All right, so generally, one way of doing taxonomy, one type of taxonomy is based on how you actually use a plant. Okay, it's based on usage, all right? And, okay, so we humans, we have classified plants into edible plants, poisonous plants, medicinal plants, and also hallucinogenic plants. Okay, a lot of drug kind of plants. Okay, among them, okay, here we have the ape, or some people call it ape, and this is also known as Alocasia macrorrhiza. It's a relative of kalo, okay, and we see the leaf here, very characteristic of this plant. It tends to have a leaf shape similar to kalo, except the apex of the leaves tend to point up. Not all the times, but a good deal of the times. And what happens is that the corm, the underground vertical stem of this plant, similar to kalo, could be baked in an imu and then eaten in chunks. Okay, so this is an example of a food plant. okay, or plant used for food. Now here we have something that people used to call datura. Okay, I guess they put it in a different group now, a different name, but it's also known as angel's trumpet. Okay, this is an example of a plant that is poisonous. It's in the same family as tomatoes and eggplant and peppers and potato. It's in the Solanaceae. Okay, another member of this group is called the deadly nightshade. Right? So I know that a lot of people, some people have allergies to potatoes and tomatoes and other edible members, but this angel's trumpet is actually poisonous. Every once in a while you hear of a case where a young person, you know, might have ingested some of this plant because it is true that that they think that it can get you high, but if you eat a little bit too much of it, it can kill you, make you really, really sick. Okay, so we wouldn't advise that at all. Okay. This is an example of a poisonous plant. And now here, this is popolo, okay, Solanum americanum. It's kind of characterized by these small, you know, berries, right? And this is an example of a medicinal plant. It's actually one of the most used medicinal plants, you know, for Hawaiian medicine. I know I have a colleague who tells a story about she was in a foreign country and she was starting to feel scratchy in her throat. So she was feeling that she was coming down with a sore throat. So what did she do? She actually thought, aha, I saw a popolo plant over in that vacant lot over there. So she said, she kind of thought about it. She thought, well, it's actually a plant that you can use for a sore throat and the coming on of a cold. So she went over there, she picked a few of the leaves, she chewed the leaves, chewed them really, really well, and then swallowed them, and then her sore throat was gone within a few hours. Okay, that's the story that she tells. Right? All right, then we also have, of course, marijuana, and in Hawaii, you know, people often call it pakalolo. Yeah, this is definitely a plant that is a hallucinogen. All right, some people think it isn't very harmful, but you know, if you have a rather narrow base of stability, you know, in your different kinds of nervous system products, this can actually send you way over the edge. Okay, so it is indeed a hallucinogenic plant. Okay. And here we have mushrooms, and of course mushrooms aren't really in the kingdom Plantae. It's not really, strictly speaking, a plant, but fungi are also studied by botanists, as you might recall from an earlier lecture near the beginning of the semester. So this is a mushroom that, magic mushrooms I guess they call it, and they produce something called psilocybin, okay, which is another hallucinogen. Okay, all right, okay. All right, next we're going to go into the history of classification a little bit, okay? So first of all, okay, people pretty much date it to this person here that's depicted, you know, in this illustration of a bust of this man, and his name was Theophrastus. I believe he was a student of Aristotle's, okay? Might have gotten it wrong, but he's considered to be the father of botany, all right? What did he do? He actually described and he classified 500 species. SPP, that actually stands for species, yeah, and species in plural. So 500 SPP means 500 species, plural, yeah? So how did he do this? He actually classified them according to their morphology or their habit of growth. You had herbs, and herbs generally have green kind of growth, flexible growth, you know, young growth. Then you had undershrubs. He actually classified a bunch of plants in the undershrubs, and these tended to be small little bushes, okay? Then you had shrubs, which are woody, of course, right? And then also trees. So he described and classified these 500 species according to their habit or according to their morphology. And here, of course, are peas, yes? So here we have some a pea plant, and you can see here that the stems are green. Okay, generally an herb tends to be rather flexible. The stems are flexible. They usually are green, though if the plant has other pigments, anthocyanins and other things in their leaves and other vegetative organs of the plant, they can still be flexible, and they could be purple, or they could be reddish, yes. And here's like a little undershrub, kind of small shrub, but you can see this kind of bushy with various stems coming off at various angles. And this is broom, okay, clearly a shrub. I guess maybe this might be about what, more than 1 meter high, probably 2 meters high. And here, that's about 6 feet. And here you can see that the branching actually starts from lower down. So that is actually what distinguishes a shrub. A shrub has secondary growth or woody growth. Do you remember what meristem produces woody growth? Remember? Kind of think about it. Right? It's called the vascular cambium. And then you also have on woody plants, you have the bark, okay, which is produced by another secondary meristem, which is called the cork cambium. Okay, so here's an example of a shrub. Now here we have a big old, it looks like an oak tree, huh? And you can see that the trunk or the main stem of the plant is quite large around. This is a very large tree. This is the type of tree that many children in temperate areas, like on the mainland United States and etc., would probably draw if you told them to draw a tree. But in Hawaii, of course, what do the little kids draw? They draw a coconut tree oftentimes. So you tell a child here in Hawaii to draw a tree, more often than not, you'll probably have the child drawing a coconut tree. And of course, a coconut tree is not really a woody plant, even though the stem seems to be kind of woody. Because remember, coconut, also known as new, also known as Cocos nacifera, is actually a monocot. And monocots do not have woody growth. They don't have secondary meristems, yep, like the vascular cambium and the cork cambium. Anyway, so this is a good example of a tree, okay, from Hawaii and other Pacific regions. Now, another botanist that had a pretty important role in the history of classification was a man called Dioscorides, all right? He wrote a book that was very influential called the Materia Medica, very important book. And this book was pretty much in circulation for hundreds and hundreds of years, okay? So in the ages between the Greek times and the Roman times till later on in medieval Europe, generally the way that people found out about plants and how you could classify them were written in these books called herbals. Okay? And these herbals, as you could tell by the word itself, herb, you know, usually refers to a green plant, you know, one that has only primary growth, right? Herbs, yes. And many of these herbs have medicinal uses, right? So they have these different kind of herbs that people had classified, and they would do these illustrations of them, okay? So if you look at this image, okay, on the computer monitor, here you can see that the people have actually hand-drawn these images of these plants, and this is actually written in Arabic because much of the medical knowledge and also knowledge in sciences that kind of vanished from a good deal of Europe, right, which so what people used to call the Dark Ages, which we now call the Middle Ages, a lot of the knowledge from the Romans and the Greeks were actually kept alive by Arab peoples. Okay, so of course they would write in Arabic. So this is an herbal based on the Materia Medica that was in circulation in the time the Arabs actually held the knowledge of mathematics, the biological sciences, and the physical sciences. Okay, that was kept alive by the Arabic peoples, right? We even use Arabic numbers now, yes? Okay, so during the age of herbals, we're somewhere about the 1400s into the 1600s, all right? So you had many different authors of these herbals talking about the medicinal uses of plants, because people, of course, you know, even at this time were mostly interested in plants for their use by humans, all right? Now, after the age of herbals, you had another age which some people call the age of discoveries, the age of the voyages of discovery, okay? So these voyages of discovery, recall that we talked about this before. You had these different people, these voyagers going out to so-called discover new lands, okay, in order to, for trade purposes, because remember, in Europe, in the medieval times and even earlier, spices and herbs were very much desired because the European diet was fairly bland, you know. Not just that, because even though Europe can be kind of cool at sometimes, well, it can be very warm at sometimes too. And because they had no refrigeration, sometimes they used something like black pepper, Piper nigrum, to actually flavor meats that were not really that fresh, you know. But they would actually eat some of this. Even that nursery rhyme about peas porridge hot and peas porridge cold, right? And peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. This is actually something that happened. People actually had their little pot of peas or different kinds of beans or other kind of legumes, and they'd be stewing it over days. They'd be eating out of the same pot for days of this food. So as you can imagine, a lot of people probably in those times died of infectious diseases, okay? Food poisoning, all right? Anyway, so these voyages of discovery, okay, included, right, the Voyager that was sent out by these two monarchs. This is Ferdinand, okay, and this is Isabella. Okay, a lot of you might remember from your American history that these two monarchs who pretty much united Spain. Another thing that they were noteworthy for is that they also drove the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula, right? Spain and Portugal. Another thing they did too is they, unfortunately, they instituted the auto de fe, right, also known as the Spanish Inquisition. Now these two rulers, motivated, by the feeling of the times, the Gestalt, right? One of the things that they did is they sent out, of course, who did they send out? Okay, Christopher Columbus, yes? So I know on the mainland people celebrate Columbus Day with all kind of marchings around and everything like that. And so Columbus Day is actually is a day celebrated by a lot of Italian Americans, yeah? Because of course Christopher Columbus was an Italian, yeah? Anyway, so these two monarchs, they sent out Christopher Columbus to try to find out a way to get to the spices and herbs. And inadvertently, he sort of discovered what we call America now. Okay, the Americas, the New World, including North America, Central America, and South America. Okay. Now next, okay, we have a giant leap, okay, by this person named Carl von Linné. Okay, he was a Swedish fellow. Another thing is that this is a portrait of him when he was a fairly young man. He actually did ethnobotany. He went, he was, very erudite, studied at very good, excellent universities. He was probably from the upper classes because usually at the time he lived, which was in the 1700s, you don't get an education unless you happen to be fairly prosperous, of the merchant class or higher. Okay, so nowadays we have what we call universal education. That wasn't true at the time that this fellow lived. Okay, so one of the things that you saw in the image is that you can see that he's wearing costumes of the people he studied. So he was noteworthy as an ethnobotanist too. So he actually went and lived with the Laplanders, the people in that region, and what he did is he studied them. Okay, he wore their dress. He actually ate the same food they did. He actually lived with them and lived amongst them. This was not necessarily common for ethnobotanists until he did. He's one of the pioneers in ethnobotany. So here he is in his Laplander costume. So he would create quite a stir. So Linnaeus, very, very important. Okay, so he did important work in ethnobotany. He actually wrote a paper on something, a plant-based rennet, which is used, in terms of cattle. They get it from a calf's stomach because it helps actually to curdle milk and make into cheese. So Carl von Linné, found out the Laplanders had a plant source for almost the same kind of compound, renin or rennet. So, give a little bit of background for Linnaeus's work. Okay? Carl von Linné, also known as Carolus Linnaeus. In the early 1700s, botanists used something called a polynomial when they actually described a plant. They would have, they would actually have a single name, a word name for it, and then a description of the plant in Latin. And sometimes this polynomial, poly of course means many, nomial has to do with names, right? So it would actually have one name that named the plant and a description, like a whole paragraph long in Latin. So it's very, very cumbersome. But of course, all these botanists are very erudite, right? They're very, very really into scholarship, a lot of writing and a lot of reading. Okay. Anyway, so here, on the computer monitor, we can see that you have this. This is actually, I think, supposed to be a drawing by Linnaeus when he was trying to put together what he called a sexual system of classifying plants. Okay. So here you can see that even his writings. I believe this is something that was constructed by him when he was kind of groping toward what he was going to get to. Okay. So he instituted the sexual system of plant classification. Okay, so here's a portrait of him as an older, very much distinguished fellow, very well respected. Here is his signature, interesting signature. Another thing about Carolus Linnaeus that was very noteworthy was he was really, really good at human relationships, and this is something that is important as you go up, and you work and everything like that. So he was very good at, making friends with people and chatting them up. He had a lot of energy, very personable fellow, very kind of charming, as well as very smart, and so he had a lot of gifts, to his personality and to himself, All right, so this might be a reason why he got to be, where he was, because he was a medical doctor. Most medical doctors at the time were still botanists, because people felt that if you were a doctor, you should know the plants that you used to treat people with. That makes sense, yep? All right. So his sexual system of classifying plants, okay, his sexual system of taxonomy was based on the numbers of stamens, the arrangements of stamens, and the length of stamens, okay? Unfortunately, well, anyway, so what he did is he actually classified angiosperms into 24 classes, okay? And he used kind of risque analogies. Some people call it kind of risque. So he would say, the husband and wife have the same bed. That means you have anther and pistil. Remember, the anther or the stamens are the male structure in a perfect flower, and the pistil, okay, which would be so-called the wife, okay, would be the pistil would be the wife. So you'd have the stamen and the pistil in the same flower, referring to the flower as a bed. So you can kind of imagine. So he'd have these descriptions such as you have 6 husbands and 1 wife in the same bed. So some of the other botanists, they just kind of raised a lot of protests about that. They're kind of shocked at these analogies. So here you have a daylily, and here you have a close-up, and you can see these anthers. Right, anthers making up the stamen with the filament, anther and filament making up the stamen. You have 1, 2, 3, 4. There should be 6. We only can see 5, I think. But here you have the stamens, and here you have the pistil. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is the stigma and the style over here. So here in this daylily, he would have said, 6 husbands and 1 wife in the same bed. Okay, kind of risque, as they say. And here you have another kind of flowering plant. Okay, this is a holly. And what you see here in one plant, you have these male flowers that have 1, 2, 3, 4 stamens, right? So here he would have said 4 husbands in one bed and 1 wife in the other bed. It's kind of a strange kind of arrangement. Anyway, so this is a system that he used. It was easy to remember, and it was easy to use, okay? So it was very simple, easy to understand for people, all right, even though it was kind of shocking at the time, So you can tell from this that this is a fellow who really had a sense of humor, Anyway, so another thing about it, unfortunately, even though it was simple and easy to understand and to apply, it was an artificial system, which means that it didn't really actually put different plants that were related to each other, in the same category. So it was artificial system, okay? Okay, so he also very famously instituted the use of a binomial system. Nomenclature just means a system of a way of naming something. Nomenclature, yeah? So binomial, 2-word system of nomenclature. So he simplified it a great deal. Remember I told you a little earlier that you had one single name and a whole paragraph full of Latin descriptions, all the way from the root of the plant, the stem of the plant, the leaf of the plant, also the flower. Okay, so the important thing that he did, he instituted a binomial system of nomenclature. He used a noun, okay, and an adjective. A noun actually, designate a thing or a flowering plant, and the adjective would be descriptive of the noun. Okay, so he used a noun and an adjective to make a 2-part name. So he published a book called Systema Naturae, and also Species Plantarum. So the Species Plantarum, that just means plant species, right? Species Plantarum, because generally all educated people at the time in the 1700s into the 1800s had to know Latin, okay? So even now, Latin is considered one of the scientific languages, all right? But Latin, every educated man had to know Latin, okay? So in 1753, he published this book, Species Plantarum. All right, very important. And in this book, he classified 5,900 plants using the binomial system of nomenclature. And this is actually the starting date, the starting point, 1753 of scientific naming using binomials. Okay, 1753. Okay, now how do we name plants? Okay, we're going to get into the system right now. First of all, common names. Common names are generally held to be good because they're easy to remember, they're easy to use, but they can have some drawbacks as well, okay? Sometimes you can have a single plant, but it can have many different names in different places, or they can even have many names in a single place. Okay, so a plant that we've seen before, the Scaevola sericea, okay, is in the plant family called the Goodeniaceae, right? We can call it the beech naupaka, We also can call it a sea lettuce. We can also call it the half flower, all right? Furthermore, okay, so here it is. Here's the beach naupaka over at Kaena Point. So you can see that this is a plant fairly common in the beach areas of Hawaii. People they can actually break off a leaf and use a juice exuding out of there, the sap exuding out of the leaf, to kind of wipe inside of their swim masks or even maybe their goggles if they have them, because it's supposed to help with anti-fogging, right? Just like the kind of fancy drops you can get at one of the sporting goods stores, right? So this is one of the things that it was used for, or is used for too. Okay, so this is definitely a plant that people are usually acquainted with in Hawaii. Okay, if you go to the beach. All right. So here is a close-up of the flower, and you can see that it is indeed sort of what they call a half flower. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. So does that make that a dicot, or does it make it a monocot? Think about that. Harken back, yeah? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals, so it's a dicot, right? Close up here, you can see this looks sort of like a anther. No, this is a stigma, actually. Here are the anthers. Okay, so it has a particular kind of structure, right? And, okay, so here's a view of the fruit. The fruits are kind of spongy and they're white. They can actually disperse through going through the water, okay? So this is a close-up of the fruit of the Scaevola sericea, all right? Now, we also have, let's see, other common names of the Scaevola, okay? And here you have one plant with many names. So we have all these different kinds of names. In Hawaii alone, okay, it was known as the aupaka, naupaka kahakai, the naupaka kai, the huahekili, all right? Other Pacific islands, it was also known as Ngau, okay, Ngahupa, Toitoi, Vivera, Nanasu. So you can see in all these different places, you have all these different names for the same plant. Therefore, there is a possibility of some confusion, all right? We can also have the fact that you can actually have different plants with the same name, sort of the inverse of the previous situation, all right? For example, this Scaevola is a native Scaevola of Hawaii, Scaevola gaudichaudiana, right? That's one. Here's one plant, so take a look at the flower, right? Then here you can see another Scaevola, Scaevola gaudichaudii, all right? You can see that it's a different plant. Okay, it's a different flower. And there's a fruit over here, probably dispersed and eaten by birds. And then here's another one, okay, Scaevola mollis. This is the same, group of plants, but it's definitely a different species. You can tell by just looking at it, okay? And fourthly, we have another Scaevola, okay? It is also different from the others. So all these different Scaevolas that we just looked at, all four of them could be called the Naupaka kuahivi. So they all had different names, but they're all very different, well, they're different plants, even if they're in the same group, okay? But still, they're different from each other. We have other examples of this too. Mock orange, in the mainland United States, I think I saw this plant in Nevada, Philadelphus species. So remember, SPP stands for more than one species. So the Philadelphus genus, okay, this is a genus of plants, and you have these different plants in this genus, in this family, the Hydrangeaceae, okay, related to hydrangeas, yeah? So we have the Philadelphus. It has a very nice smell, very pretty smell. And then you also have another kind of plant, okay, called Maclura pomifera. So you can see that this is in another group known as the Moraceae. Okay, the Moraceae are included in that group, include ulu or breadfruit. We also have auke, also known as paper mulberry. So this here, also known as Osage orange, but in some places it's known as mock orange, okay? Then thirdly, another mock orange, which we're more familiar with here in Hawaii. We have the Muria. Okay, so this is what we in Hawaii usually call mock orange, in the Rutaceae. So it's actually in the same family as the regular orange plant. Yeah, navel oranges and other kind of oranges that you eat. But this is a Muria. Okay, so you can see that we have three different plants, and here's a close-up, and it has these compound, right, pinnately compound leaves, and it has these definitely Rutaceae, a citrus family kind of flower that it has. Okay, here's some fruits, yeah? So this is what we usually know as mock orange, but you can see the confusion. If, like, say for example, if I was to go onto the mainland and go to a nursery in, say, Virginia or Pasadena or something like that, and ask them, do you have mock oranges? They might direct me to a plant which I'm not familiar with at all. Okay, so you can see a little bit of a problem in terms of using common names. Okay, not everybody agrees that all things are the same. Okay. Anyway, so the thing is, in terms of scientific names, okay, so each kind of organism is referred to as a species. So each type of organism, okay, and its near relatives that it can pretty much breed with is considered a species. Okay, and what they'll do, some botanists do, is what they'll do is they'll actually have species that are similar to each other. They're grouped into another group called a genus. Okay, and the plural for genus is genera, Genera. All right. So every species has a two-part name. It uses a genus name and what they call the specific epithet. So using a scientific name, binomial nomenclature, you always have a two-part name. Okay, always two-part. The first part of the name is called the genus name. The second part of the name is called the specific epithet. Okay, so here it is, sort of like what Linnaeus did. The genus usually stands for a noun, and the adjective generally stands for specific epithet. Okay, so both ways that it goes. Now this name generally has to be either in Latin or some kind of a Latinized name. It's actually Latinized. Why do people use Latin? It's because Latin is what they call an extinct language. It's actually what they used to call a dead language. Yep. Because English, Hawaiian, other Polynesian languages, Asian languages, European languages, they're always changing. They change and they evolve depending on the needs of the people who use it. Latin is not really used that much anymore. I think maybe in the Holy City, the Vatican City, they will actually use Latin. They can use Latin and they will say Mass in Latin. But in other countries in the world, in other countries that have, Roman Catholicism, they will actually do the Mass in Spanish, or in the United States, they'll do the Mass in English, okay? So Latin is not a language that will change because nobody uses it anymore, or nobody in a general population. People consider that, of course, Italian is just about the closest you can get to Latin now, yeah? So Latin is a dead language, and that's why people use Latin. Okay. Now, when you have this Latinized word or Latin words, okay, generally the name is always underlined, or italicized, or bolded. You don't have to do all three. It can be either underlined, or italicized, or bolded. Okay. And I believe in the presentations that we are doing in this class, generally, I think the format that we're using is that we're underlining the Latin names. Now, another convention that people use is that the genus name's first letter is capitalized. All the rest of the letters in the genus name is lowercase, all right? Secondly, the specific epithet uses all lowercase letters. Okay, so the only capital letter in this whole two-part name is the genus name, the noun, the first name, okay, of this. So the scientific naming, okay, so every species has a two-part name. And it's almost like names in a telephone book. Okay, so when you look at a telephone book, you might look up, Garcia, and you see, let's see, Aaron. Okay, Garcia, Aaron. So sort of Garcia, or the family name, comes first, and then of course in the phone book, Aaron would be capitalized. The first word of the Aaron would be capitalized. But that's sort of like in Asia, they generally use they'll also use family names, right? So let's see. I know my grandma, my mother's mother, when she was alive, I would ask her, could you write my name, in Japanese? And she'd write it in katakana, right? Because even though I'm Japanese ancestry, but still, I'm still foreign. I'm not really a Japanese person. It's kind of a strange thing. Anyway, so she'd write my name in katakana, and it would be Nishimoto Enji, because that's what they used to call me when I was little. Anyway, so she would write it in katakana. So my last name would be first, and then my first name would come after. So that's one way that you can kind of think of the name. Okay, last name first, sort of like in Asia, like even Chinese people and some other Asian peoples, they'll generally be called by their last name. I had a roommate, or housemate. There was a whole house full of girls that I used to live in, and one of the women was from Korea, and she said her name was Lee. That we called her Lee, and that was just her last name. So in some Asian countries, people go by their last name. That's what people will usually call them. All right, so okay, like names in a telephone book. Generally, the genus is the more important. It's actually a more important grouping, because my last name, my brother's last name, my two sisters' maiden names, okay, would have been the same. So we're in a larger group, okay? Anyway, so the genus too is a larger group. Okay? It actually will contain different species. All right. Another thing too is that you would also kind of be using this classification almost like books in a library. Okay. Anyway, so if you have books in a library, what is a big divide between one kind and another? Okay, you'd have, let's see, you'd have fiction and you'd have nonfiction. Okay, you have all the nonfiction in one area, all the fiction in another. And in the nonfiction category, you would have what? Anthropology, maybe. You would have you might have cookbooks in another. You might have biology in another, obviously biology in another, you know, like that. So that's one way. Okay, in terms of fiction, you would have what? General fiction. You also have romantic fiction. You have detective fiction. You have science fiction. So they're sort of like books in a library. They're actually organized, you know, according to type. Okay, so you can think about that each species is a different type of a certain kind. Okay. Now another thing that is good about using scientific names. Okay, I know that it's difficult. I know that when people are first exposed to scientific names and they're like, oh my gosh, am I going to have to remember the scientific names? Well, you know, I think that it's important because for another thing, it's actually the so-called correct way to do it, okay? Because scientific names are universally accepted. Okay, if you use Muria paniculata, every person in the world would be able to look it up and to find out that this Muria paniculata is what we call mock orange in Hawaii, okay? So this is universally accepted. You could have a scientist from Brazil, okay, communicating with a scientist from China, and they would know what each one was talking about if they use their scientific names. Okay, if they actually used common names, of course, they would have no idea. Especially if the Brazilian scientist speaks Portuguese, right, and the scientist from China speaks Mandarin, yeah, or Cantonese, you know. So generally, if you use a scientific name, then you actually have like a common ground. Okay, it's universally accepted by all scientists. All right. Okay, the next section we're going to get into. Anyway, so we talked about scientific naming. Okay, we talked about the history of classification. Now we're going to get into what we call the taxonomic hierarchy. What is a taxonomic hierarchy? It actually has to do with how we group different kinds of individuals, okay, according to types. All right. So what we use nowadays is something called the phylogenetic system. Phylogenetic system, okay, so think about that. Okay, philo has to do with, I guess, branching, and genetic has to do with relationships, right? Okay, so here's an early phylogenetic scheme. What it's actually showing is the lineages. Okay, so don't have to worry about, you know, the words that are on here. Just kind of remember that when you look at different kind of plants or even different kind of animals, they'll actually be part of what they call a family tree. So generally, you know, using a phylogenetic system, you can actually show relationships between different types of organisms on the tree. Okay, there's actually a song. Never mind. That's kind of going off into a tangent. So what this is actually good because it actually bases classification on natural groupings of organisms. Okay, you'll actually have one type of organism on one branch, you know, say animals on one, you'll have another branch on another, these will be the plants, and etc. So this is more of a natural grouping that will reflect how these different kind of organisms are related to each other and between themselves and everything like that. Okay? All right, so what we call the higher taxa. Okay, so we talked about a little bit about species, right? Species have that two-part name using binomial nomenclature, right? And then we also have higher grouping. So a taxon, which is singular of taxa, is just kind of talking about different way we group different things, okay, different kinds of living things, okay? And in the past, in fact, Linnaeus was the one who instituted, everybody's heard of this, animal, vegetable, or mineral, because he not only tried to classify living things, but he also classified minerals as well. So that's a classic, animal, vegetable, and mineral. So generally, in living things, we actually had that first big divide between animal and vegetable, okay? So higher taxa, we're going to get into that soon, not in today's lecture, but in a future one. So if you actually go to higher taxa, groups such as rose, so this is a, excuse me, this is a photograph of dogwood, okay, dogwood rose or a dog rose, yeah, very pretty. And here's a photograph of a same, another rose in the same genus. So the first rose and this tea rose here are actually two different types of rosa. Rosa is a genus name. Okay, remember that genera refers to more than one genus. Okay, so you also have lilies. Okay, so two different members of the lilium genus is you have something that some people call tiger lilies, okay, or enchantment lilies, and you also have Easter lilies. Okay, as far as I know, these are two different plants in the lilium genus. Then, of course, you have orchids. Okay, orchids such as this Cattleya. This is Cattleya labiata, I believe. Okay, so the orchids are some orchids can be in the same genus as well. So you could have like this Cattleya labiata. You could have other Cattleyas such as Cattleya aurantiaca, Cattleya, etc. Okay, I'm just joking. Anyway, so you have different types of orchids in the same genus. Okay. So first you have species, and you have genus. Okay, and then another grouping is if you have similar genera, okay, different kinds of genera, they are actually grouped together in something called a family. Okay, so if you want to look at what we have here on the Elmo, all right, here we actually have native red hibiscus. Remember, this is the hibiscus clayi, also known as Kokio ula. Okay, one of the things you notice is that here, the structure that's right at the center, well, it has 5 petals, so that makes it a dicot, right? It also has this structure here. What is this? This is these little yellow spots here are actually anthers. And the anther and the filament, they're fused around this area here. This little 5-parted structure up here is a 5-parted stigma. Okay, so the female structure in the flower, remember, you have the sepals, you have the petals, you have the stamens, and you have the pistil. So the female part of this flower actually pokes through and goes all the way and is exerted out, okay, where you have the fused stamens. So this is actually hibiscus too. So this is a characteristic of hibiscus, okay? Another hibiscus flower here, and this one here is actually one that is a hybrid. Okay, this is like an ornamental hibiscus, probably a hibiscus rosa sinensis. That means rose of China, or a flower from China. So many of the hybrid hibiscuses are pretty much classified that way. Okay, so they're hybrid hibiscuses. These are man-made or human-made hybrids. It has the same structure here. You have this long sexual structure here, okay, with the stamens, and you have this 5-parted stigma sticking out, okay, so that you have the stamens with the fused filaments all the way around, okay, and then you have the female structure, which is, partly down here. You have the ovary down here, you have the style, and you have the stigmas at the top, the 5-parted stigma, okay. So you can tell by looking at these two flowers, you can pretty much tell that they are related to each other just by their structure, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. Okay, you can see that they're related due to their structures, especially their sexual structures. So taxonomists or systematists, they will actually group flowers, okay, and or different kinds of plants according to their flowers, because generally in a flowering plant, okay, the sexual organ of the plant, that is the conservative part of the plant. That's a that's a part of the plant that tends to be conserved from one species to the next. You see similarities between the flowers, okay? Now here we have another flower. This one is a little smaller one, okay? And you can see too, this is a little smaller. Let's actually zoom in on that. Let's see. Okay, if you look at this, you can see it's smaller for one thing. Okay, this is actually an abutilon. It's in a different genus. Remember that I said you could have species in a same genus, like the two hibiscuses are in the genus hibiscus, whereas this one here is in another genus known as abutilon. You can see it's a little bit different looking, okay? So the abutilons are actually in a different genus, all right? But all 3 of these flowers, okay, so abutilon, of course, is in a different genus. The 2 hibiscuses are in the genus hibiscus, but they're actually grouped together, okay, in the family Malvaceae, or the mallow family, okay? All right, so then we can see that you can have genera that are similar to each other, but they're grouped together in a family. So what happens is that this is something that they would call a natural system. It has to do with how these flowers and plants are related to each other. Animals the same way. Animal taxonomy is the same way. Okay, so using these similar genera to make a family, okay, what we use are the conservative characteristics, okay, of flowers and fruits. So here we come back to the orchids, and we always come back to the orchids. This is a kind of dendrobium orchid. It's called a nigrohirsute orchid, okay? This is actually a dendrobium, okay, a dendrobium orchid. So this is in one genus, okay, in the orchid family. Here's another this is an orchid hybrid for sure. It's a Phalaenopsis, so it's in the genus Phalaenopsis. Phalaenopsis means butterfly, yeah, butterfly orchid. Yeah, so these are very beautiful. Another kind of orchid too. We also have, this is an interesting one. This is in the I forgot what genus. I think it might be Orchis, but it might be another. Okay. Now this is kind of interesting because one of the ways you have these different orchids, okay, that are actually not real closely related to each other, but one of the ways that orchids can actually keep themselves, you know, one species distinct from a different species is that they have high pollinator specificity. Now this kind of orchid, if you look at it, try looking at this flower. If you're kind of nearsighted, like I am, if you can't see it that clearly sometimes, if you look at it, doesn't it look like maybe a bee? Okay, so this plant is actually pollinated by bees, or male bees in particular, because what does this kind of flower do? It actually looks like a bee, because most insects, they don't see very well sometimes, you know. So you actually have a thing that looks like a bee, a flower that looks like a bee. Another thing, it will actually exude or give off the aroma or the pheromone of a female bee. Okay, so what the male bee does, it actually comes along and it tries to mate with this because they think that it's actually a female bee. In the process of trying to mate with this, usually depending on the different kind of flower, it might push its head against, you know, the column structure, and then get the anther pollinia dumped on its head or wherever on its body, and then it gets like, what's happening? So it flies away, goes to another flower, and somehow pollinates that other flower. Okay, as a process of pollination known as pseudo-copulation. It's amazing, yeah. So scientists kind of think of all these different kinds of interesting things. So this is some of the stuff that people study in science. You know, very, very interesting. And I think even Charles Darwin was somebody who really studied pollination mechanisms in flowers as well. And so in all the different kinds of flowering plants, among the most interesting and varied pollination mechanisms that you'll ever find are in the orchids. And of course, the orchids are like the largest, it could be the largest plant families. It could be maybe up to 25,000 different species of orchids. Up to 25,000, isn't that amazing? And another thing about them too, these are species, okay, that a lot of them you can cross with each other. We're going to see that a little later. But they're like tens of thousands of hybrids, okay, orchid hybrids. Okay, so orchids are in a whole category on their own. All right, so here we have the different features of flowers and fruits. Aha. So you can see here, you can see all these are all in the orchid family. Okay, whether it's a Cattleya like this one, or let's see, I think they call it Psychopsis. It's what they call a butterfly orchid. I think they'd had a different name before, but this is related to Oncidiums. You know, the little popcorn orchids is in this same grouping. You also have others that I can sort of see here. Maybe these are dendrobiums, but all of these groups, even if they can't hybridize with each other, but they're all considered part of the same family. Okay. All right. Alrighty, so another thing is that you have similar families in a particular order. Okay, so that's another level of higher taxa. Similar orders to each other are in a class. All right, so we have here lily, okay, which is in the class Monocotyledonnae. Remember that these are monocots. They tend to have flower parts in threes, right? Threes, 3 and 3, and you have 6 stamens perhaps, right? All right, and here's another member of the same class in the monocots. This is the grass, all right? Thirdly, we also have onions. Onions are also in the Monocotyledonnae, all right? They're monocots. So you can have very diverse groups, okay, come together, but they are, if you go back far enough, they're very much related to each other, okay, amazingly. So you have the monocots and you have the dicots. Those are 2 classes, okay, in something called a division. And the division, okay, in this case, so division is roughly equivalent what zoologists call a phylum, okay? So this is a division. So this is actually I think this is a magnolia relative. Maybe, maybe not. But anyway, so the division that they're in is called the Magnolia phyta, okay? The flowering plants. Okay, so the word angiosperm isn't really a technical term for botanists, but if you say angiosperm or flowering plant, everybody will know what you're talking about, you know? And now all these similar divisions, such as a fern, such as, remember the Psilotum that we looked at earlier, the moa? I didn't give you that name, but the plant that had those photosynthetic stems, that's definitely a plant, okay, in the division Xylophyta. Here's a fern in the division Pterophyta or Pteridophyta. You had the Magnolia phyta. Anyway, the different divisions are grouped together into a kingdom, okay? And of course, from the kingdom level, okay, you have different kinds of kingdoms grouped into something called a domain. So how are you going to remember all of this? Okay, how are you going to remember all of this? All the way from species, all the way up to domain. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. But first, we can see that this is what they call maybe like a cladogram in a way. So what they're showing is they're showing different sorts of plant groups. We're going to get into this in the future, so don't worry about all these names right now. But you have all these different kinds of divisions. Remember division or phylum. Okay, and so they don't have the Xylophytas. Well, you have the Pteridophyta or the ferns. You have the Magnolia phyta, okay, or the flowering plants. They're all plants. So this kind of scheme, cladistics, actually a family tree sort of thing, will actually show you how some of these different kinds of plants are related to each other and their line of descent. So this is what they refer to when they talk about a natural system of classification. It actually illustrates relationships between one group and the next. All right, so here, here it is. Okay, similar kingdoms, you have the domain. So here are different kind of animals. We have these nice lions, beautiful animals. Here, these look like orcas or killer whales. These are jellies, used to be called jellyfishes. What is this? This is, this looks like a bird. Yeah, it's a bird. And here you have a reptile. So you have reptiles, you have aves, you have I guess this is a mammal, cetaceans, and you have invertebrate, and you have a mammal, right? A land mammal, terrestrial mammal. So when you have similar kingdoms, you'll actually put together in a domain. And this is actually, all these organisms are part of the kingdom Animalia, okay, animal kingdom. Didn't there used to be a show that way? Another kind of kingdom, okay, in this grouping. So animals, also fungi. This I think is an amanita. Okay, it could be a death's angel mushroom. All right. So the animals and the fungi, and the plants. Okay, and the protists. This I think is a paramecium. Okay. Look at that, you can see the contractile vacuoles. Interesting, huh? Anyway, so all these different kinds of organisms, the animals, the plants, the fungi, and the protists are grouped together in a particular domain known as a eukarya due to certain commonalities that these different groups have in their cell structure. Remember way back, we talked about living things having organized structure, and the basic unit of a living thing is a cell. Okay, so all these different kind of, very divergent, very diverse sort of organisms, they all have similar types of cell structures, right? Including the nucleus and the mitochondrion, the cell membrane, and etc. Remember? This is something we talked about way early in the class, okay? So how are you going to remember all of this? Okay, how are you going to remember all of this? Because you are going to have to remember it. Okay, so what do we have? Okay, so this actually tells you, okay, it actually is a mnemonic. A mnemonic is something that helps you remember and memorize something. So think of this, dear King David, come out for goodness sake, okay? So domain, D, kingdom, K, division, D, class, C, order, O, family, F, genus, G, and S for species. Okay, so give you that mnemonic because probably you'll probably have to know this for the exam. Okay, all right. So dear King David, come out for goodness sake. Okay, so that's a good mnemonic. Alrighty, let's see. The last topic that we're going to kind of try to address, okay, is what the heck is a species after all? What is a species? Okay, this is something that a lot of people have been thinking very hard about, for a good long time. Okay, so what is a species? All right, so first of all, an early definition of what a species is, okay, use what they call a biological species concept. This was put forth by a brilliant fellow named Ernst Mayr. Okay, in 1942, he was quite an adventurist. You know, a lot of people who are into biology, especially field biology, they really are. They're like Indiana Jones. They go into all these different areas. You know, go through all these hair-raising activities and almost get their, almost lose their neck sometimes. Anyways, so Ernst Mayr, earlier in his career, he worked on, I believe, birds. Yeah, in New Guinea, in the New Guinea area. Yeah, so he actually went out into the jungle and he actually noted the birds. And one of the things he noticed is that his system of classification, okay, his way of actually naming the birds, or not naming them, but grouping them according to what type, very, very closely corresponded with the native New Guinean people who had, almost the same amount of species as he put them in. And he was, I guess, a very, high-level scientist. He might have been from Harvard, not sure though. And anyway, he's a giant, of biology. Okay, so he actually put forth what they call the biological species concept, and this is a direct quote. What is a species? A group of interbreeding populations reproductively isolated from any other such group of populations. So what does this mean? It means that with plants or with animals, it has to do with breeding behavior. Okay, so this actually really refers really pretty good to animals, okay, but well, we'll get into that in a little bit. So a group of interbreeding populations. What is a population? A population is members of a single species that live at the same place at a particular time. Okay, and this population will be isolated reproductively from other groups of populations, okay, that might be similar. In this way, you have sort of like a mechanism for what we call speciation, where you have one species becoming another species or becoming two different species, as long as the two groups are reproductively isolated from each other for a long enough period of time. Okay? It's a good biological species concept, very excellent, okay? But this is something that is problematic for plants, because plants don't behave the same way as animals do in some ways. Okay, for one thing, related species, species that are fairly closely related to each other, even different genera, even at the genus level, they can interbreed for some plants. Okay, so here we go, back to the orchids. Here's a Cattleya labiata. Okay, this is a Cattleya in the genus Cattleya, but this is in what some people call a tribe or a subtribe of the orchid family. So you can see that classification kind of breaks down into even smaller and smaller groupings and intermediate groupings too. Okay, so here's a Cattleya. This is what they call a Brassivola. Okay, this is, you can see it's a different orchid. And this is a Rhyncholalia. Okay, Rhyncholalia glauca. Okay, and here we have a Sophronitis. Okay, Sophronitis, and here we have a Laelia. Well, what about all these different genera? They're all in the Cattleya grouping, or all in the Cattleya group, so they can actually be crossed by humans. And the result of that, of course, is those beautiful hybrid orchids that are really huge. Like when you watch Japanese contests, like the one of those song contests or something, and you see the Japanese judges, they'll actually have these big corsages, male and female, right in the middle of their chest. Okay, so even though these flowers look really, really different from each other, they're closely enough related that they can breed with each other, even though they're different enough from each other that they can be put in different genera. Okay, so this can happen in plants, noteworthy especially in the orchids. All right, and in Hawaii too, we have the Silver Sword Alliance. Right, you have three different genera. You have the Wilksias, the Dubadias, and the Argyrosiphiums, and these three genera can mostly pretty freely interbreed as well. Okay, important point. Right, another problem, okay, with in terms of plants not really fitting the biological species concept is that a particular species might have different individuals, different organisms in the same species with a different number of chromosomes. That means it has different ploidy. Okay, so you might have one. So this is Winothera, okay, which is also known as evening primrose. Okay, there's a botanist named Hugo de Vries who was very famous. Okay, so he actually crossed the different kind of evening primroses, and he came up with a new species. And what happened is just that the new species had double the chromosome number of its predecessors. Okay, recall too, we also talked about wheat before. Okay, that actually had doubling of chromosomes as well. Okay, so you can have a species that have individuals with different kind of ploidy numbers. So what happens is that even if they might be descended from the same individual, they can't breed together because they have different chromosome numbers. So in this way, this species can actually, have individuals that are isolated from each other reproductively. Okay, so plants behave differently from animals. Okay. All right, so because of some of these difficulties, some people have put forward something that they call the ecological species concept. Okay, and in the ecological species concept, they use the concept known as ecological niches. Okay, what is a niche? A niche is some kind of position in the environment that a particular species can occupy, such as, okay, here, this is, I think, some kind of tropical forest. It looks like, yeah, it looks like palms and such. Well, in this kind of forest, you might have epiphytes, right? So you can have an ecological niche, where you have plants that live on other plants having to inhabit a particular area. Okay, so that's one example of an ecological niche. We also have, something like this. I think this is a Namibian desert. Okay, and another thing is that even though it looks really barren, even in deserts you can have plants growing. So you can have a kind of plant that lives on a particular substrate, whether it's sand near an oasis or near the mountains or somewhere in here, but you can have one plant inhabiting one particular niche. Okay. Thirdly, in some islands, with like shoreline and steep poly or cliffs, you can have certain plants that live, right in the intersection between shoreline and cliff itself. You can have other plants that live along in the area where they definitely get salt spray. That's their ecological niche. So in a particular, geographic area, you can have plants living in various places, in all these little nooks and crannies, wherever you can think of, So they have like an ecological species concept where you have a particular kind of species occupying one type of particular ecological niches. And it might have other species that are related to it, but they live a little bit away from it. They could be geographically separated from each other. Geographically separated as well as separated not just geographically in terms of one living here, one living there, but according to the ecological niche they live in, such as in the seashore, you might have one with the roots in the sand, okay, spreading out over the sand. You can have another group that live in and amongst basalt lava flows, talus slopes where the boulders have fallen down from the mountain and have a particular habitat. You could have that too. You could also have different members of the same genus, living further inland where you have dry shrub, dry forest to the mesic forest, and etc. Okay, so the ecological niche concept can also be useful in terms of trying to differentiate one species from another. Okay, all right, and then we also have another kind of concept, which is the genealogical species concept. Okay, this kind of holds with the idea, okay, that different organisms that are related to each other of the same genealogy, they would actually have very similar molecular sequences. Okay, whether the sequences would be the sequences of nucleic acids, right? Remember, you'd have these nucleotides making up the nucleic acids. So it would be the molecular sequence of the nucleotides making up a nucleic acids, or the amino acid sequences making up a particular protein. Isn't that really something? So in this way, people can pretty much pinpoint, because the closer the DNA is of one organism to another organism, the more closely they're related, right? So this, I think, is showing like sequences of, I think, particular types of, let's see, typical either genes or maybe amino acids. Okay, so this is just showing an example. So they actually see in some places they match up, letter for letter. Okay, like here, right, K, A, F, we have G, we have C, we have Q, we have N, and etc. So if you have a close correspondence between the nucleotide sequences or amino acid sequences, making up these sequences, what you'll have is something more closely related to something else. So usually they'll group something as an out group, and you'll have the in group. And in this way, because generally they know that mutations happen maybe 1 out of every billion times DNA is copied, you can actually trace and maybe even pace, the process of speciation. Okay, one species coming from another species. Okay. And also here we see a chromosome with the different genes mapped. here's a single chromosome, and you have all these different genes. So what they can do is they can actually take a chromosome, find out what gene is located where, and compare them one to another. Okay, isn't that interesting? So technology keeps on developing. You know, technology keeps on moving us forward. We have different kinds of evidence that we can use. Okay? All right, to summarize what we have seen today, okay, includes the history of classification. And we did do a little bit of botanical history as well, from the father of botany, you know, through the father of taxonomy and etc. Okay? We also talked about, you know, the father of taxonomy, Carolus Linnaeus. Okay, he was a quite a very extraordinary man. And then we talked about the system of naming that Carl von Linné introduced, okay, which was binomial nomenclature. And we also talked about the taxonomic groupings, you know, from the level of the domain all the way to species. Okay, remember the mnemonic, right? And then we also talked about different ideas of what can define a plant species. We can see that in animals and in plants, sometimes what works for one doesn't work for another. Okay, but we do know that different living things are related to each other. Okay, anyway, so that's all that we have for you today. Okay, hope that you enjoyed this, all right, as I did, all right, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.